It is indeed my pleasure and honor to invite Mr. Andre Pienaar to take the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mandela said it always seems impossible until it's done. And in reflecting on his leadership and his life, this certainly is written large about his legacy. In 2015, the United Nations issued 122 guidelines for the way in which nations and governments should treat prisoners, and named it the Nelson Mandela Rules. And this is a testimony to the courage and the resilience of President Mandela, who served for 27 years, many of which in solitary confinement in Robben Island, and part of his legacy. President Mandela said that some men get broken by difficulties and others are made by them. This is certainly written large over his leadership and his character and his lifestyle. And the Nelson Mandela Freedom Plaza will be a reminder for generations to come that the impossible can become possible if underpinned by struggle, by moral conviction, by belief, and by resilient leadership. And I imagine President Mandela in conversation with Abraham Lincoln just across the road on the National Mall about these values. Many leaders contributed to the establishment of this vision and the realization of this vision today, and I just want to say a very partial thank you. I want to thank Judy Ainsley, the chair of the board of the USIP, for her leadership, and two of the previous chairs, Ambassador George Moose and Steve Hadley. I want to thank President Lise Grande for her leadership and her support, and Nancy Zirkin, the chairperson of the International Advisory Council, the amazing USIP team, Rusty Barber and Anne-Marie Gwen-Saxon, who put today's event together. Three dear friends who encouraged this project throughout: Chet Crocker, my mentor, General Jim Mattis, and Steve Wisnant. And then a special word of thanks today to Senator Warnock and Ambassador Bridgetti for their remarks, and Ambassador for your leadership in South Africa. And then finally, I want to say thank you to my dear wife, Teresa, whose unconditional love and support for this project have carried us throughout. I had the honor of working with President Mandela in my 20s. When I was 26 years old, quite unexpectedly, whilst discussing a very difficult problem with him following the recent bombing of a restaurant in Cape Town, he put his hand on my arm and asked me to help him rebuild law enforcement and intelligence in South Africa. This led to the establishment of the first law enforcement agency of a democratic South Africa, which was called the Directorate of Special Operations, or the Scorpions for short. And the purpose of this agency was to defend a young democracy against three threats which Mandela saw as existential for a young democracy: corruption, organized crime, and terrorism. In line with the President's vision, this agency was a creature of statute and was created following the unanimous passing of a law in the South African Parliament. And it became one of the most successful law enforcement agencies in Africa and the international community, and a trusted partner of US law enforcement. In the years that I worked with President Mandela on this project, I learned many leadership lessons from him, and I just want to share a few with you this morning, because I think the Nelson Mandela Freedom Plaza embodies these lessons. The first one, which was very important to President Mandela, was the alliance between South Africa and the United States. Like Winston Churchill, President Mandela believed that the only thing that's harder than fighting without allies is fighting with allies. And so President Mandela loved America. He came here just a few months after he was released from prison in the summer of 1990, addressed a joint session of Congress, did a press conference with President Bush on the southern lawn of the White House, and kept coming back ever since. He came to America many, many times throughout his presidency and had 3 visits at the White House, dealt with 3 presidents, and his last visit was in 2005 when he was 86 years old and he could no longer visit. During his presidency, he didn't go to Moscow. In 1999, he briefly went to Moscow to meet President Yeltsin, and he visited China twice, but he kept coming back to America. And that's because, as Ambassador Bridgety said, President Mandela felt that there was a shared set of values between South Africa and the US that would be enduring and lasting. And so when he tasked me to set up this unit, he said, go to America and find the best people who can help defend democracy in South Africa. And the first person I brought to see him was a very senior CIA officer. In South African culture, men often hold hands. And they would hold the hands of their friends or the hands of their relatives. And when I brought this senior CIA officer to meet President Mandela, the first thing he did was to take his hand. And he held his hand throughout the entire meeting. Didn't let go of his hand until he walked him out to his car. And when he said goodbye to him, he said, South Africa needs your help. And some weeks later, when some of the resistant forces and apartheid elements that remained in the government tried to run a disinformation campaign about the help that President Mandela asked from this gentleman, he put out a press release, and the headline was, Mandela asks CIA chiefs help to combat organized crime in South Africa. So President Mandela loved America, and he believed in alliances and the strength of alliances. He also believed in the strength of diversity, and diversity as a source of strength. And so when we created the Scorpions, he said we must go out and recruit 100 of the brightest young black graduates in the country. And he asked the FBI to train half of them at Quantico, and they were the first group of foreigners to do a full FBI training course, and the other half at Scotland Yard. But he said to me, Andre, these young men and women won't have a frame of reference, they won't have experience to do really tough cases. So I want you to go and find detectives from the old order who are now aligned with democracy and who believe in the new South Africa, and bring them into the unit to train and to mentor these young graduates when it comes to tough cases. And we did that. And that leads me to the second leadership lesson I wanted to share with you, which is that President Mandela believes that reconciliation, even though it's hard, even though it's difficult, even though it sometimes seems out of reach, can unlock new possibilities. The third lesson is something that really defined the man, and he would say this often. He would say, cherish democracy. Not protect democracy, not defend democracy. Cherish democracy. And the reason why I said that was because he truly loved democracy. And he learned the value of democracy the hard way through suffering. And so one of the values he gave to this unit, the Scorpions, was that it must be beloved by the people. He said the people must feel that the unit is on their side and looking out for the weak and the vulnerable and the poor. And it must be loved by the people, but feared by the bad guys. The final lesson I want to share is one of optimism and resilience. One day when things were going very badly, and we thought that we'd been done over by some very bad people, he took me aside and said, Andre, when I was in prison, I twice read in the newspaper that I'm dead. And look, I'm still alive today and I'm the president. He said, you have to be an optimist and you have to believe. And he said, no axe is sharp enough to cut through the soul of a sinner that keeps on believing, keeps on trying, keeps on struggling, and that's determined to rise again. I think this is the message of the Nelson Mandela Freedom Plaza. Thank you.